Welcome, I'm John Ankerberg. We've traveled to 3 continents to ask historians and archaeologists, is the Jesus of history the same as the Jesus of the Christian faith?
Well, we found that some scholars claim the early Christian church fabricated the story of the Nativity to create a cover for Jesus being Mary's illegitimate son. Other scholars say that the gospel writers did not give us an accurate historical account of the events surrounding the Nativity. But is this true? Well, to find out, we traveled to Europe to talk to one of the most respected Jesus scholars in the world. Dr. N.T. Wright taught at Oxford University in England for 22 years. He was canon theologian of Westminster Abbey and is now Bishop of Durham. He has been featured on NBC, ABC, CNN, and Fox, and is the author of more than 60 books.
What we find in Matthew and Luke are 2 very strange stories, because Matthew and Luke both, I'm sure, knew that out there in the wider pagan world, there were people who told stories about Alexander the Great being conceived when his mother was a virgin, about Augustus similarly, about various heroes and demigods. And since Matthew and Luke both want to talk about Jesus as the fulfillment of Judaism, which didn't have stories like that, this is really kind of a dangerous ground for them to be getting into. And so I asked myself as a historian, why would they do that? Particularly when the obvious sneering retort to such a report is, oh, well, we know Mary was just sleeping around with Roman soldiers or whatever, which is precisely what some of the enemies of Christianity went on to say. So it seems to me that Matthew and Luke would not have included those stories unless they really believed that something very strange like this had happened.
Well, I got to ask you this question now because it comes up. You have material, information, but you have 20th century people that come to this material with presuppositions. Can history, straight out, lead us to the conclusion that Jesus was God, he did the supernatural, miracles took place, etc.? Or does something have to happen before we approach that material? Because a naturalist would say, hey, if I see the miracles, they didn't happen because miracles don't happen. How would you advise people to look at these texts?
It's a good question, and I think it's an important question for our day, because I think most people do approach the Bible and they go, this is pretty unusual stuff. And the fact is it is. And in fact, that's the point. The fact that it's unusual is the point. You know, virgin births don't happen every day. And the reason God did it this way was to mark Jesus out as unique, as special, so that Joseph finds himself in the dilemma of having this girl that he's betrothed to who's pregnant. He knows he's not responsible. In his mind, that leads to only one conclusion. Some other guy did this. Now there has to be an explanation for why that doesn't work. And the interesting thing is, in thinking about, that states it positively, thinking about it negatively, you have to come to the view of, does the alternative explanation make sense? Let's work with the virgin birth. I think it's a problem to say that the early church created a cover-up for an illegitimate Jesus, because someone would have known that birth was illegitimate. And if there really was a belief that Jesus' birth was illegitimate, he never would have gotten out of the starting blocks as the Messiah, as the holy, chosen Messiah of God.
Now we understand that one of the biggest problems people have with the Nativity story is the miraculous aspect of the virgin birth itself. So we traveled to Jerusalem to ask scholars how they answered this question. Dr. Claire Fawn is professor of New Testament studies at the University of the Holy Land in Jerusalem. She's appeared on CNN, Fox, and the BBC as an authority on the historical Jesus.
It's historically probable that Jesus was born of a virgin. And both Matthew and Luke, working independently decades after his birth, as they search for the data that they can put together on his birth, come up with that as one of the 12 points that they share in common: a virgin birth, a divine conception. There had been many slurs and innuendos about Jesus, but in this they both agree.
Now, of course, I cannot prove the virginal conception of Jesus, and I don't think you can prove it in the same way as I would prove the resurrection, that you can't explain the rise of early Christianity without it, because, as I say, you can explain Paul's theology without ever mentioning the virginal conception, because Paul never does. So that it's not the same kind of argument. What I want to say is, though, that if the resurrection happened in the way that the New Testament says it does, and frankly, if it didn't, I can't explain as a historian how Christianity got off the ground, then that forces me to hold my modern mind open to say, if God was really in Christ reconciling the world to himself, ought I not to expect some other strange things as well? And when I then have these stories which look so strange, and yet, why would they do that? Maybe it really did happen.
Now, one thing that almost every scholar we talked to agreed on is the religious power of the Nativity story. But the question is, does that power stem from the fact that the story is historically true, or just that it's a good story?
I think they do have power. I think part of their power is in the history, the fact that these things did happen. In fact, I'd argue that part of their persuasiveness historically has been the fact that people believe that God did something special in Jesus. He was responsible for the birth. Angels did appear. And although you could treat it like an English literature story, like a novel, and say, well, there's still truth in it even if it didn't happen. There's perhaps some truth in that at one level, but that's not what the Gospels are. That's other kinds of literature.